Hi, my name is Barry Doyle. I'm a lawyer in Chicago. I'm here today to talk about what happens if your employer doesn't have workers' comp insurance and you get hurt on the job. The bottom line on it is that all is not lost, although it's a very complicated situation and you're going to need to get legal help for this. It's important information for people who work in the trucking industry. Unfortunately, the situation where you have an employer without workers' comp insurance happens more often than it should, especially in the trucking industry. So this is going to be good information for people who work in the trucking industry. If you do, or you know people who do, please hit like, hit share so that we can circulate this information around. So let's talk about what happens if you get hurt on the job and your employer doesn't have workers' compensation coverage. The law in Illinois is that if you are an employer, you have to have workers' comp insurance. It provides some very basic benefits. If people that work for you get hurt on the job, it pays them 2/3 of their average weekly wage while they're off. It pays them their medical expenses, and they're entitled to a lump sum settlement for permanency that's associated with the injury. Having workers' comp insurance isn't one of these things that it's optional. It's not a benefit like health insurance or a pension or something like that. It's something that employers are required by law to have. The only real exception to that is if you have what's called a certificate of self-insurance from the state, which basically you're not going to get unless you are a large trucking company or large outfit that set aside enough funds to pay any potential claims for people who get hurt on the job. Where we tend to see the issue of, quote unquote, no workers' comp insurance a lot in the trucking industry is where you have companies that operate and call people who are really employees, quote unquote, independent contractors. And essentially it's a big benefits and payroll tax dodge that employers do to basically get out of paying Social Security and unemployment taxes and that kind of thing and shift the burden of that onto the people who actually work for them. Now, even though you get called a quote-unquote independent contractor, in Illinois the law is actually that the courts look at the substance of what was happening, and if in substance you were an employee of the trucking company, you're still going to be able to get benefits even though you were a quote-unquote independent contractor, a quote-unquote 1099 employee, or whatever they want to call it. If in fact you were really an employee, they still owe you workers' comp benefits. So, let's just take a real common scenario. You get hurt on the job, you report the injury into your employer, and your employer says, I don't have workers' comp insurance. It's a bad situation to be in. It certainly is uncomfortable. They're supposed to have it and supposed to give you the information for their workers' comp carrier right away, but instead they're just saying, I don't have it. The first question you need to really ask and need to get to the bottom of is this information actually accurate? Do they really not have workers' compensation insurance? Sometimes you'll have employers who will say, I don't have workers' comp insurance when they do because they want to avoid having a claim on their record, avoid having their premiums get jacked. And, that's certainly understandable from the employer's perspective, and it's good for them. But if you're the guy who got hurt on the job, it's not good for you. And usually this bit of false information about I don't have workers' compensation insurance is followed by, well, why don't you run it through your health insurance and say that you did this at home? And that's a rabbit hole that you just don't want to go down, because then you are going to be creating essentially a false record that, if you ever decide that you do want to pursue a workers' comp claim, is going to be there. So, instead of saying that you hurt yourself, lifting something, unloading a truck, you say that you hurt yourself lifting fertilizer in the backyard while I was doing some gardening. If you hurt yourself lifting things, unloading a truck, that can be covered by workers' comp. But, if you hurt yourself lifting fertilizer in your backyard, that's not going to be covered. And what would happen to you is that when you pursued a workers' comp claim, that record would come back and bite you in the rear end and leave you getting nothing in the way of benefits. So, it's important that you don't dive down that rabbit hole and try to be a good team player and try and say that you hurt yourself some way other than how you actually hurt yourself. They always say honesty is the best policy, and this is one place in particular where it's very, very true. The first thing that you need to do to get to the bottom of things when you have an employer say, I don't have workers' comp insurance, is find out, is this actually true? And sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. If it's not true, then eventually that is something that will work itself out, and the claim will get turned over to the workers' compensation insurance company, and they will take charge of paying you your benefits and handling the claim otherwise. Let's go to the other scenario where it's actually true that in fact they don't have workers' comp insurance. Okay. So what would happen then is that the lawyer who you're working with would file a inquiry with the state to find out, do they actually have workers' compensation insurance or not? If the answer comes back no, the state has its own enforcement mechanism to go after your employer to find them and do other things that you really don't need to concern yourself about. But what would happen then is that the state actually runs something that's called the Injured Workers Benefit Fund. And this Injured Workers Benefit Fund would step in and essentially provide you the benefits that the insurance company would provide you if your employer actually had the coverage that they were supposed to have. So the bottom line on it is, there are some extra steps that are involved in dealing with the Injured Workers Benefit Fund. Is a little more complicated than dealing with a regular insurance company. But in the end, there is some place where you can get your benefits paid. You can get the 2/3 your average weekly wage while you're off. You can get your medical expenses paid, and then you can get the lump sum for permanency that's associated with your injury. So all is not lost. That's good news. The other consequence that comes out of your employer, in fact, not having workers' comp insurance is this. One of the trade-offs for getting workers' comp benefits is that you give up your right to file a civil lawsuit against your employer in return for the no-fault benefits that you get as part of the workers' compensation system. Now, sort of the legal bargain that's worked out in terms of the Workers' Compensation Act is that the employer is supposed to have insurance to cover you. Now, if they don't have that insurance and they're not self-insured, then what happens then is that they lose that immunity against a civil lawsuit, by you for damages. And that can be significant because the amount of money that you can collect in a civil lawsuit is potentially a lot more than you can get in a workers' compensation claim. And there's quite a bit that goes into that, but the bottom line on it is that potentially is a claim or a case that has much more value than your workers' compensation case. So there's that effect that comes out of your employer not having workers' compensation insurance. So they lose that immunity from a civil lawsuit against you. They also don't have many of the normal defenses that a defendant in a civil lawsuit would have. The Workers' Compensation Act, by virtue of how it's written up, strips those away. So it's actually a case that you're much more likely to succeed in. Then it becomes a question of, is that ever going to be a collectible judgment, and so on and so forth. But that's a remedy that becomes available to you as a consequence of your employer not having workers' compensation insurance. So it's an interesting avenue to pursue. The bottom line on it is, if you have an employer who's telling you that they don't have workers' compensation insurance, it's time to get good legal help, because you want to get to the bottom of this. So to kind of summarize, first thing that you need to do once you're told that your employer doesn't have workers' compensation insurance, even though they're required to, is get to the bottom of, do they really not have workers' compensation insurance? And if that's the case, basically what you end up doing is getting your benefits paid to you by the Injured Workers Benefit Fund, which is something that's funded by the state of Illinois. There's also the consequence that your employer loses its civil immunity from civil lawsuits filed by you. So I hope this has been helpful. If you think it's been helpful, hit like, hit share, so that this can get out into your network and other truckers can benefit from this kind of information, because unfortunately this is a situation that happens a lot in the trucking industry. If you have questions, feel free to visit our website, www.rightsofinjuredtruckers.com. There's a contact form there where you can submit questions, or you can simply call our office at area code 312-263-1080. Hope this has been helpful. Knowledge is power. Have a great week. Take care. Bye-bye.